Hey everyone, welcome back to the Energy Blueprint podcast. I'm your host, Ari Whitten, and today I am with my good friend, Roland Pankowicz. So for those of you watching the video, you guys can see, obviously, Roland resembles Jesus Christ, but he is not. He is, in fact, my good friend, Roland. And I'm really excited to have him on the show. We're going to talk about some really amazing content that we've never talked about on this podcast before. Really novel, amazing, powerful stuff. So I'm excited to get into this. Let me tell you a bit about Roland. He is the CEO of Health Optimization Practice in Canada, where he also will be opening the country's first HOPE, or Health Optimization Practice clinic, later this year. His background in clinical nutrition and functional medicine give him a wide scope of theoretical understanding on the topics of biochemistry, as well as practical applications to client care for his clinical practice. In addition to working with health-focused clients and athletes, in addition to seeing clients, Roland consults for supplement companies like Microbiome Labs and Designs for Health as an educator and content creator to support clinical practitioners all over the country who want to upgrade the caliber of their client care. I will also mention he is the protege of Dr. Ted Achacoso, who is an anti-aging and endocrinologist expert, world-renowned, that has been on this podcast 2 times before and had some extremely popular episodes. So welcome to the show, Roland. Such a pleasure to have you on, my friend.
Thanks for having me, buddy. That was an awesome introduction, and I feel like because you mentioned Ted, I have big shoes to fill. But the reality is, he's not a very big man. He's got small feet, so that's kind of an ironic thing to say.
Yeah. Yes, indeed. So we are going to be talking about the gut and the mitochondria and the link or the communication between the gut and mitochondria. So there's some really amazing science around this area. To kind of get us started, I would love to, and also just to make sure that we don't sort of jump into too technical of stuff too fast and lose people. I want you to just start with kind of a basic overview of the importance of the gut and the importance of mitochondria, what they are, the basics of what they're doing.
Perfect. So let's start with the gut because it's kind of becoming my area of focus. Most people know that, yes, the gut is where all the food that we eat goes. We digest that food and we pull those nutrients into our system and we use them to actually feed our mitochondria to make energy. So that's the first layer of connection. But when looking at the digestive system, we know that there's an absorptive aspect to it. There's an ecosystem that lives in our gut. You know, we refer to something called the microbiome, which is one of the most hotly contested areas of, I guess, research and in some cases debate right now. And the microbiome is a collective of the cells in our digestive system, the bacteria, which are called the microbiota that inhabit the digestive system, and the immune and neurological axes that interact with the entire scope of those 2 previous things that help regulate our overall function. So our gut immune system is controlled primarily as a result of our digestive function. We have something called the gut-brain axis. So an example of that is a food you eat can affect your mood, or something that you do in your digestive system can send a signal up to your brain and they can talk back and forth. And then on top of that, we have to maintain this ability to keep the contents of what's inside our digestive system in the tube and not get things that are not meant to be in our bloodstream translocating, or the whole phenomenon of leaky gut. So we want to maintain a protective barrier. When we look at the mitochondria, I know that you've talked about this quite often, so this might be something that many people know. These are basically the energy producing centers of our cells. So the foods, the carbs, the proteins, and the fats that we eat are most often processed by the mitochondria to make energy in the presence of the oxygen we breathe. But on top of that, mitochondria are important signals or stimulators of immune function, neurological function, and they're one of the primary areas of response when it comes to threats coming in from the food we eat. So an example would be the connection that I mentioned before. If we eat something and that substance has a bacteria or something on it, like food poisoning, which I'm sure everyone can relate to, it's the communication back and forth between the microbiota and the mitochondria that regulate the body's response to that. So it is a very dynamic thing, but we're looking at 2 separate entities or organisms that talk to each other to regulate their ability to keep our health in check.
Mm-hmm. And so Well, I was actually about to jump into something more specific, but let's keep it going from here. So, what are some of the variables that affect the function of our gut or the health of our gut and the microbiome? And then the second part is, what are some of the variables that will affect the health of our mitochondria?
Sure. Both of them are responding to inputs, right? So everything you put in your mouth, for example, will reach your digestive system. That will have a massive effect. That is the principal thing that really causes the betterment or the compromisation of our digestive health overall. So when we're looking at the gut, we want to make sure that first and foremost, our gut's working properly. The digestive cascade from the beginning when we start chewing food to when we release our waste material on a regular basis is not only a seamless process, we shouldn't know what's going on. So if we're looking at something for our listeners to take away, if you have any symptoms of poor digestive habits or poor digestive processes, you know that something along the way has been compromised. You know, starting at the stomach, we may want to make sure we make enough hydrochloric acid so we can break down proteins properly. Looking at the pancreas and the gallbladder, making sure that we're making enough enzymes and bile to digest those foods. And if that process is optimally taken care of, the absorption through our digestive system of the vitamins, the minerals, and the macronutrients is going to be regulated, and it's going to maintain a healthy gut. If we're eating the right kinds of foods as well, we're going to be feeding our gut microbiota. So it's the trillions of bacteria that live in our gut, and it's kind of like an ecosystem. Each species needs its own aspect of different food variety. So providing we're eating a diet that is high quality food, free of pesticides, chemicals, which is very big for people down in the West Coast, things that are not processed, avoiding gluten, dairy, things that are often inflammatory, that's going to keep our gut working very well.
Mm-hmm. Gotcha. And so the epidemic of gut dysbiosis, and maybe you can define that for people, and then gut permeability or leaky gut. What are some of the key factors that are driving those issues?
So dysbiosis as a term is something that's pretty new, but I'm sure most health-focused people will be familiar with it. Dysbiosis refers to the state of the bacteria that live inside your digestive system. So to backtrack and explain to people, we have thousands of species of bacteria that live in our guts, and they all kind of work in conjunction with us, the host, to make sure that there's a hospitable environment for them to live, but they're also helping to improve the health of the host because it's a symbiotic relationship. Certain variables can compromise the bacteria themselves as a balance or a ratio. So usually when someone has a dysbiotic gut, it means they have an overgrowth of bacteria that are problematic or that are disease-causing or pathogenic. So when they have high levels of disease-causing bacteria, usually you have an increased level of inflammation. And we know that inflammation is typically at the root of almost all chronic degenerative diseases. What happens in the gut when you're highly inflamed is the barriers that control the gut and prevent the breakdown become compromised. So the bacteria live in this mucous medium, right? So it's almost like they have their own little environment. And if we have an overgrowth of pathogenic bacteria or a dysbiotic gut, that mucus starts to thin. And then when that mucus starts to thin, what ends up happening is those bacteria can actually interact with the cells that absorb all the nutrients that actually process the food that we eat. So when this interaction takes place, the immune system becomes responsive. And when the immune system becomes responsive, it starts increasing the inflammatory response to try to kill these bacteria so they don't create that leakiness. And then the contents of the digestive system don't get into the bloodstream. So when someone's highly dysbiotic, this process is happening almost 24/7 around the clock. And if it's taking place over months, years, in fact, then it can be the transition from an imbalance to a syndrome state, to a disease state, to a full-blown disease. And typically we see the connection very highly in autoimmune patients, chronic fatigue, fibromyalgia, things of that nature, because the dysbiosis is driving the inflammation. And when you can't rectify the inflammation, you can't restore health.
Right. Got it. And that was a great explanation, by the way.
Thank you.
So mitochondria, what are some of the inputs that are going to affect the function of our mitochondria?
So it's a really good question you asked because it ties into the previous point. So the body should always have the ability to be in a pro or anti-inflamed state whenever it wants. What I mean by that is if something happens, like if you roll an ankle, for example, what happens to that ankle? It swells up because that's the first step in the healing process. But providing you don't overuse it, you don't, you give it time to rest, that ankle will eventually retract and normal function will be able to be maintained. The body should always have the ability to respond to a threat, but it should always have the ability to calm down. If you look at the most up-to-date research when it comes to mitochondrial function, the thing that affects them most prominently is uncontrolled, unregulated inflammation. Why? For a couple of reasons. First and foremost, when the cell's inflamed, it typically has an inability to regulate energy production as efficiently. So the mitochondria themselves are essentially under attack from pro-inflammatory compounds. If this happens, locally, it might affect a specific tissue or a specific organ. But if it's a systemic thing, like, for example, you have endotoxins or various compounds floating around in your bloodstream, these compounds can find their way anywhere that the blood supply is directed. So it can affect mitochondrial function systemically. And we as a being, a human, we're only able to produce energy to the efficiency of how well those mitochondria function. So when looking at the principle or the primary cause of mitochondrial dysfunction, it ties back into what causes the breakdown of our gut is unregulated levels of chronic systemic inflammation. Because we want to make sure that we can make as many molecules of energy, which we call ATP, for every food we eat. And we want to minimize the amount of mitochondrial dysfunction because the food we eat can't be converted into the energy that our body needs.
Yeah, excellent explanation. There's one aspect of this that you've touched on several times, but I want to point this out because it's really important. A lot of people look at mitochondria as sort of just mindless energy generators. They're just in our cells. They're one of the organelles of our cells. This is how we learn it in biology class in high school or college. You have all these different organelles of the cell. The mitochondria is one of them, and the mitochondria is responsible for producing cellular energy. They're the powerhouse of the cell, quote unquote, which is all true. However, the more modern understanding of mitochondria in the last 5 or 10 years that has been built out by a number of studies, probably most prominently Robert Naviaux's work around the cell danger response, is showing that mitochondria also have this other critical role in cell defense, in defending the body against threats. And they can detect the presence of things like an infection, things like inflammation, things like immune overactivation, the presence of toxins. You mentioned endotoxin. I know we're gonna get more into that, but many other toxins, heavy metals, and BPA and fluoride and chlorine disinfection byproducts and all these other things. The mitochondria is able to detect the presence of that, and is in response to that, it initiates in the innate immune system. So it creates basically its own sort of immune system cascade that's designed to protect the cell against threats. So really the mitochondria have these two roles. We could think about them in this way of energy production and defending the body against threats. And that's kind of what you've been talking about as far as what shuts down the mitochondria and results in mitochondrial dysfunction. Things like immune and inflammatory activation. The more that's going on, the more the mitochondria shut down energy production and switch more into a defense mode.
That's absolutely true. And it's a great thing you brought that up, because that's a very strategic decision by the body. But if you make that a practical experience, someone might say, well, man, I feel tired all the time. I'm doing everything I can do to try to increase my energy levels. And they don't realize that the body is saying, and the mitochondria specifically are saying, no, we're not going to let you do this high intensity thing. We're not going to allow you to experience more stress because you have this unregulated threat that's currently in our system. To make an example of what you just said, so say your body has been infected with a disease, pathogen or a virus or something. Those viruses, just like our cells, need energy. So rather than produce a lot of energy, your body will actually blunt the energy production response, and it will stress out the cell so that whatever's trying to live and inhabit inside the cell will die off, hopefully. Then it can return to normal function.
Yeah.
I look at the mitochondria as kind of like the quarterback of what's going on inside the cell. And this is true for any area of the body. Without energy, nothing sustains. Energy is primordial to not only life, but especially when it comes to health. So if we're constantly bombarding our mitochondria, compromising their ability to do their principal job as energy production molecules, or not molecules, organelles, then the downstream cascade of everything else will be compromised because they have other roles and regulations to fulfill.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I want to go one layer deeper here.
Do it. I love deep.
So part of what you're talking about in a simple way is this: how the cell makes the mitochondria helps make the cell inhospitable to, let's say, a virus or a bacteria. Within that context, let's talk about reactive oxygen species.
Sure.
And the role of reactive oxygen species from mitochondria, and then how they're involved in that process of cell defense, and let's say defending against an infection. Because a lot of people are under the impression, again, that free radicals are just all bad, and that we don't want free radicals. We want to take our antioxidants, neutralize the free radicals. So talk a bit about why free radicals are important, how the mitochondria are producing them, and then specifically what role they're playing in this context of defending the cell against threats.
Sure, yeah, I love this topic. So free radicals are most easily thought of as signaling molecules. So they're a means of communication because everything inside the cell has its own ability to be alive and to speak, right? So what the mitochondria do is they communicate with other organelles, specifically the nucleus of the cell, via free radical formation and signaling. And how that works is the mitochondria is essentially a massive positive negative charge pump. I mean, I don't want to bore people with the details, but protons, positive charge, electrons, negative charge, are being pumped across a membrane, and it's the energy potential of the change in that membrane that ultimately drive the body's ability to make energy. Sometimes, however, the mitochondria themselves, rather than make energy with that gradient, will combine an electron with an oxygen molecule and create what's called a free radical. And this free radical has the ability to not only affect the mitochondria locally, but if it gets outside of the mitochondria membrane, it can travel as a signaling molecule. It's kind of like sending a smoke signal or sending a message to someone. They're going to be receiving it from a long way away, but they'll know what the main message is.
Yeah, that's a great way of thinking about it.
It's nothing more than a way for the ability to communicate what's really going on inside the cell, to make sure that both the nucleus and the mitochondria can change their tactics to suit what's going on. Mm-hmm. So if there's a virus coming in, the reason you're raising the free radical formation is to stop energy production so you don't feed the virus, is to signal to the nucleus to change the genetic expression of how the cell can defend itself. And the third thing is high levels of reactive oxygen species. This is where people have the perception of them being bad. They oxidize, meaning they create like a rusting inside the cell. And we assume oxidization is bad, and then the opposite is good. It's really the balance between those two. It's called the redox balance, which really shows you that, again, like the immune system example, you want to be able to raise inflammation when you need it. You want to be able to relax when you don't. You want to be able to increase free radicals when you need them. But if you're not sick or you're not compromised, you want to lower free radicals because that raises the ability to make energy. Mm-hmm. And a lot of that is regulated by environment, the input signals from the food you eat, the air you breathe, the activity. But in the context of the mitochondria, that's how they communicate back and forth. And is it okay with you if I kind of jump into a cool example of how we connect the gut?
Yeah, absolutely.
So a beneficial example of how this communication back and forth goes is that the mitochondria will use free radicals to signal how the cells can maintain the internal environment of the microbiome. So one example of how we keep the bacteria happy, we keep the immune cells and the epithelial or the absorptive cells happy, is by maintaining barriers. The way I look at it is separate and mediate. So we separate with a physical barrier of mucus, meaning the bacteria can't penetrate through that. And then we mediate with these antimicrobial molecules from the immune system. So if that physical barrier fails, we have a plan B. The way we maintain the physical barrier is actually through the body's ability to regulate reactive oxygen species within the mitochondria of the colon cells, which stimulate the renewal of mucus. Mm. So if we shut this process down, then we're taking away a free radical dependent mechanism that actually maintains our health. Mm-hmm. So it's not a nefarious thing, but it's actually a positive thing, providing it's kept in check. Almost like, hey, buddy, we need more mucus. All right, signal the molecule, raise the ability to make energy, secrete new mucus, and then that happens on a regular basis. While we're doing this talk, we're both secreting another layer of mucus. And then when it's done, we will have secreted it, so it's a regulatory feedback system that's maintained by free radicals.
Yeah, yeah, very well explained. I want to jump back to what's happening in the cell for just a second, because there's a couple important points you made. One is that this oxidizing environment, or the cell or the mitochondria producing lots of oxidants, is not inherently bad. It's something that in a certain context, let's say where there's an infection present or there are toxins present, that oxidizing environment for the mitochondria to shift out of energy production mode towards producing more free radicals is actually a beneficial and protective thing for the body.
Yeah, it's like almost containing that virus or that pathogen. It's like a self-mediated quarantine, if you will.
Right.
An attempt.
Yes. And so I want to just connect the dots for people, because to the degree that your mitochondria have shut down energy production and are defending against threats, are shifting towards producing oxidants to defend against whether it's an infection or toxins or whatever type of stress. There's even new research. I don't know if you've seen Martin Picard's research on mitochondrial psychobiology, but they're even showing that he's one of your Canadian brethren, man. You gotta.
Oh.
But it's brand new research. I'll send you the study.
Cool.
Really cool stuff about, like, they're looking at psychological stress and how that's impacting the mitochondria. So they're basically that oxidizing, that shift from energy mode to defense mode is a protective response. But I just want to connect the dots for people so they realize that the symptom that you feel on a big picture level, as far as what you as a person are actually feeling when a lot of your mitochondria are doing that, is you feel the symptom of fatigue or low energy levels. So that is essentially what fatigue is. It is when a lot of your mitochondria have shifted out of energy production towards defense mode.
The idea of being able to raise energy levels via something, I mean, the intention is good. Obviously, you want to feel better. But I think that, the idea that the body makes no decision by accident should make people take stock in, well, how have I not thought about this idea first and foremost? Because if it's a protective thing, rather than raise energy because you feel fatigued, and this is what I see with a lot of my client successes, is we have that as a beneficial side effect of addressing something else that's a chronically smoldering ember in their body that's never been taken care of.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I want to come back to one other thing that you said in passing that I think is a really important point that a lot of people maybe didn't quite get. And, that is for many, many years, for decades within biology, it was taught that our DNA is sort of the boss. That's what's in the nucleus of the cell, our DNA, our genes. That's the big boss. That's what's giving the orders to everything else. And everything else is downstream of the DNA. What we now know, and what you were referring to, is something called retrograde signaling, where mitochondria are producing signals, like smoke signals, as you said, which I love that analogy, smoke signals, which are going back from this organelle of the mitochondria, which is supposed to be just sort of taking orders from the DNA. It's sending signals back to the DNA in the nucleus of the cell, and influencing which genes are getting expressed, which genes are getting switched on, and which genes are getting switched off. So for example, I'll just name just one example here. So if you stress your mitochondria out with physical exercise or with a number of other hormetic stressors, let's say sauna or certain phytochemicals, it activates this retrograde signaling, and it goes back to the nucleus and switches on an NRF2 pathway, which then creates various beneficial signals. It stimulates the growth of mitochondria, the creation of new mitochondria from scratch, and a number of other signals. It also shuts down another gene expression pathway called NF-kappa B, which is a pro-inflammatory signaling pathway. So it's literally affecting the expression of genes that are impacting on energy production, impacting on inflammation levels in your body, and so on. So I just wanted to kind of build that out a little bit more, because you touched on it in passing, but I think it's an important point that people understand all these really, really important roles that mitochondria are playing.
Yeah, it's almost like is the nucleus really the boss? I look at the nucleus as a library or a database of information, but someone has to tell you which book to read. Someone has to go fetch the book, and we need to know what to extract from that book. So the whole idea is that the mitochondria, I look at them as the quarterbacks because they're making the calls as to what genes are being expressed. To your example, if the body needs to be inflamed, then let's get better at raising inflammation because it suits our purpose. Let's go stimulate NF-kappa B. If we've been inflamed for a while and we need to calm the fire, let's get at the fire blanket. Let's go get the NRF2 guys, because those are going to signal the downstream activities of what regulates the actions inside our cell and thus our organ, thus the whole body. And this is only a little communication back and forth between these two organelles. And it's incredible how deep and detailed it is and what the research is showing us, because now we're able to take that research and then on a more practical, applicable level for someone who's a patient, a client, whatever you call them, we're able to give you actions that are going to yield or lead to hopefully a resolution or an improvement of your state, because we can give you a deeper understanding of what's going on.
Absolutely. So let's talk about some of this communication or this link between the gut and the mitochondria. How are they linked? How are they communicating? What is this all about? Give me like the big picture overview.
So the big picture overview is one reason they're communicating is for the maintenance of an optimal environment for them to both live in. I mean, it's that simple, right? So, in some ways I look at us as just a host for bacteria. We have trillions of bacteria all over us, inside of every orifice. And these bacteria, just like all humans, have the prime directive to survive. If you look inside a cell, a mitochondria technically used to be a bacteria species, right? It used to be a separate thing entirely until it found a cooperative arrangement with a cell based upon variables that are millions and millions of years old. So the reason they communicate fundamentally is to create a better environment for themselves to survive and thrive. That being said, knowing that, we have to then understand that the way they communicate and the way they mediate things is to improve our health. So it's a bi-directional communication. The main things that we find that they control or they influence are things like energy production. So what's going on locally in the gut can not only affect your overall gut health, but it can affect the peripheral mitochondria, say in your muscular tissue or other aspects of your organ function. We maintain things like redox balance, which we talked about. They control immune responses. The communication back and forth based upon, for example, the foods you eat can stimulate the production of new mitochondria locally in the colon and thus in the body systemically. And then the last thing you can do is, if we focus in on the gut, because that's obviously where we're highlighting our talk, the back and forth communication can influence things like gut barrier function, cell division, and cell renewal. So all the things that have to happen to take place to keep us healthy are essentially governed by these two guys going back and forth. And the X factor are the food, the lifestyle inputs that we put in our systems, because they're just responding to those things to find balance.
Yeah, excellent. So let's dig into some of the specifics, the layers of this story, because I know there's a lot of layers to this, and maybe the best way, and you decide if this is the best way, but I'm just thinking maybe one way of explaining this is to kind of take people through a sequence. And actually, what are you drinking there? Some methylene blue water?
It's actually just a colored glass. It is just straight.
Oh, it's just
water.
Blue glass. Okay.
Blue glass. Yeah, no, I'm not going. I'm not going super mitochondrial function today. I should have actually for the topic.
You should have, yeah. So I was thinking maybe like kind of take people through the sequence of how this can play out. Starting with maybe some gut issues and then what's going on in the gut and how that then gets relayed to the mitochondria.
Yeah, let's use one signaling molecule for the sake of ease, something called the short chain fatty acid, which I'm sure you've discussed multiple times, right?
I don't know if we have discussed that at length, but
okay, well,
you should build that out actually.
Perfect.
Yeah.
So short chain fatty acids are these essentially energy containing compounds that are created when the bacteria interact with fiber. So we think we take fiber so we can go to the washroom on a regular basis. I mean, the reality is, yes, there is a benefit to that. But on top of that, because I said bacteria are just trying to find their ability to survive, they need a food source. So specific fibers and a variety of different plant foods are donating that food source to the bacteria, which they break down via fermentation, the process where you make alcohol or you're making sauerkraut and kimchi. And what that does is it actually allows not only the bacteria to get a source of food, but they donate those molecules to actually improving the environment in the colon itself. So this is the first layer of a symbiotic relationship. So let's assume the digestive process went well. You have intaken different kinds of fibers from some green vegetables, maybe some sweet potatoes, or you've had some fruit. These fibers are going to get through the small and then principally the large intestine. Most of this happens in the colon itself because we have a lot more bacteria residing in there. And then when they break down these compounds act as signaling molecules to improve, in the case of the mitochondria, the ability for them to make energy and ATP to absorb not only food more effectively, but to maintain the integrity of the colon lining. So this short chain fatty acid, which is created by the bacteria, will actually be transferred into the cell of the colon, directly into the mitochondria, which will enter the energy production process and result in the formation of ATP energy. Providing this happens on a regular basis, there's enough rich energy source for the mitochondria in the colon to always be optimally functioning and maintain a healthy gut barrier. So this is an optimal scenario because when you look at the preferred source of fuel in the gut, it's actually a fatty acid because that's what the mitochondria are designed to burn for energy. How this can be perturbed or imbalanced is, let's say someone takes a course of antibiotics. A course of antibiotics is a very non-specific way of wiping out a large scale of bacteria. So although it might take care of the pathogenic organisms or the infection, it's going to cause a compromisation to the whole host of bacteria that are meant to work in this network, this ecosystem-like symbiotic network that I mentioned prior. The course of antibiotics might compromise some of those bacteria that break down those fibers. So all of a sudden you have a drop in the production of short-chain fatty acids, which leaves a food shortage for the colon cells. So what they need to do now is they might need to default into a different source of food because there's not fatty acids available. They're going to start becoming more glycolytic. So they're going to make energy a more primitive way using glucose, which isn't as optimal. Because there's a lesser availability of energy, now the colon cells can't produce mucus as well. They can't support their ability to maintain the gut barrier, and the inflammatory process might be able to ensue because you're creating a dysbiotic environment. So what does that mean for the client or for the person? Well, they may start experiencing gut issues. It might be something like an IBS response. It might be something like an inflammatory bowel disease if this goes on for long enough. It might be something like the development of leaky gut, which can cause both local, but more likely peripheral changes. All of a sudden they have brain fog, they have mood snap changes, they have aches and pains in their joints, all because things that are in the digestive system don't actually have the ability to stay in the gut. They're actually getting into the bloodstream now. Mm-hmm. So that's an example of how we imbalance one signaling molecule, like a short chain fatty acid being produced from the right kinds of food, having a non-dysbiotic gut. We can see the cascade leads to a breakdown in normal function.
Mm-hmm. And that the short chain fatty acids are used by the mitochondria.
Yes, they're one of the preferred sources of fuel, if not the preferred source of fuel is butyrate. But there are two more main ones, propionate and acetate, which help regulate immune function. So as you mentioned before, they help regulate the balance between the innate and adaptive immune systems. Mm-hmm. And they also signal the gut-brain axis via the vagus nerve because they can enter general circulation and affect how the brain can form ketone bodies for something like that, as an example.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. What is another layer to this story? So this is kind of like, this is a really important layer that you just went over, but let's talk about, there's so many good layers to talk about here. Let's talk about the endotoxin layer.
Ah, yes, the lipopolysaccharide.
Yeah.
Can I give you a little analogy that allows me to always make this a practical thing for people? I have to swear. Is that a problem?
Not at all for me. I will be for some segment of the population. Maybe 5% of people are really offended by swear words, but I'm okay with that. If you're warning to everybody who's offended by swear words, please cover your ears for the next 20 seconds.
Well, lipopolysaccharide is what an endotoxin is, right? But that's a very hard word to remember. So what I call them is little pieces of shit. It's easier to remember. Always.
LPS.
LPS, baby.
LPS, yeah. Well, just so people know, they're abbreviated as LPS for lipopolysaccharide. So that actually works really well. Well done.
Thank you. Thank you. It's a practical example or easy to remember. So if we go back to the pathologic state that I just described, we have a dysbiotic gut, we have inflammation, and we have leakiness. Then these little LPS guys, which are a normal part of every bacteria inside of the cell, it's how they attach onto the mucus. When these bacteria die, the LPS gets released from their cell membrane, and it can get into general circulation if you have excessive leakiness. One example is, they find people with leaky gut have higher levels of HDL and LDL cholesterol because that's the way the body tries to keep these things in check. If the body can't keep them in check that way, what ends up happening is these LPS molecules can circulate in the bloodstream and cause an inflammatory response with every immune cell or every epithelial cell that they come in contact with. There's an evolutionarily conserved mechanism that are called toll-like receptors, and they're ways that the body and the cells can sense invading threats from viruses, pathogens, stuff of that nature. And they're designed to be able to raise the immune system response in response to these LPS guys being in high concentrations of the bloodstream. So what they find from how do we make a practical example is people with poor dietary choices, people with leaky gut, and people who eat high carb, high fat foods typically have the highest levels of lipopolysaccharides or LPS circulating around their bloodstream. Every time they circulate around the bloodstream, wherever they find themselves, they can initiate an inflammatory immune response. That could be in the liver, that could be in the brain, that could be in the muscular tissue. And every time we eat that kind of diet, providing we have a digestive system that is that compromised, we essentially raise this response. And over time, we break down the body's ability to regulate this response because it comes back to the epigenetic thing. If I'm always needing to be inflamed, I might as well get better at being inflamed. Mm-hmm. So then what's this going to do? It's going to connect to the whole idea of chronic fatigue. Why? Well, if the mitochondria are always getting the same signal because of these little endotoxins in the gut getting into the bloodstream, I'm going to downregulate energy expenditure or energy production so I can direct resources to powering my immune system's ability to break these things down.
And it's worth mentioning that there's research showing that LPS has is directly toxic to mitochondria, and there's research actually showing that it shuts down mitochondria.
And it also changes the balance of the immune cells and the compounds they make in order to keep everything under control. These cytokines that are made in response to LPS will also drive the raising of the NF-kappa B transcription factor. So the body is always in a state of crisis. That's the way I look at it.
Yeah.
All because we have poor gut health from poor dietary choices and not optimizing our essentially lifestyle variables to remedy the situation.
Yeah. And on a big picture level, as far as the evidence, we also know that all this process that you just described, there's research now linking this with neurodegenerative diseases, with dementia and Alzheimer's. There's research linking it with cardiovascular diseases as a key driver of heart disease, as a key driver of diabetes, and many, many, many other chronic diseases that are major killers in our world.
As seemingly unconnected as issues with the endocrine system. It can drive the change in how the hypothalamus is able to regulate hormone expression. Because again, the body's not meant to be under chronic threat all the time. It's not a crisis thing like a staph infection where you need to go to the hospital or else you will die, but it is a great way to initiate degeneration over the course of 2, 3, 4 decades if it doesn't actually get resolved.
Yeah. And I'm not sure if I've seen research on this, but I'm sure there is. Have you seen research specifically on this process of endotoxinemia and linking it with autoimmune conditions, linking it with hypothyroidism? And
I've seen it connecting to autoimmune diseases via specific mechanisms that we assume to be at play. The thing that seems to be most connected to this is if you have high levels of inflammatory response, then the immune system becomes less able to decipher the difference between self and not self.
Right.
And then you add in conjunction cross-reactivity to specific foods where the food proteins or peptides may resemble a body protein or peptide. I believe it's called molecular mimicry.
Yeah.
The increased potential of an autoimmune disease could theoretically happen as a result of higher levels of LPS in the body.
Right. Excellent. So that is obviously a very, very important layer to this whole story of how the gut links with the mitochondria. It also links up with the brain in that way because endotoxin is also neurotoxic. So
yes, and it can get through the blood-brain barrier, which is, that's a problem because the brain is a very fragile organ that although it does have some aspect of immune regulation via astrocytes and microglia, when there's high levels of toxins in the brain, it can shut down areas of brain function, or I shouldn't say shut down, but dysregulate key areas of brain function that we will notice. Brain fog, mood dysregulation, short-term forgetfulness, even behavioral changes can all be driven by this process.
Yeah. And with that in mind, I think this is a good time to point out to people how interconnected everything is. And we haven't even gone, there's more layers to this story that we can get into, but I want people to just get a sense of how interconnected all these systems of the body really are. So we're talking about how changes, let's say your diet or taking a course of antibiotics, or just, the way that you eat and live on a daily basis for years, creates shifts in the microbial balance in your gut, and how that affects the protective layer in your gut and can potentially lead to gut permeability. And now you have chronically, you have toxins, endotoxin or LPS, leaking into your bloodstream, which are then having widespread effects on, essentially all of the organ systems of your body, but especially your mitochondria and your brain, and creating this chronic pro-inflammatory and immune overactivated environment throughout the body, which can result in it can manifest in all sorts of different symptoms and diseases. But so there's this connection between the gut and essentially everything else, the body's immune system, the organs, the mitochondria, the brain, cardiovascular system, it's hormones, it's affecting everything. So this is why, for like trying to pinpoint one particular cause or one particular thing that's off, and then going to chase after, let's say people are fixated on, for example, cortisol. Somebody, a lot of practitioners are in the adrenal fatigue paradigm. And so somebody comes into their office complaining of fatigue, and their paradigm is, oh, it's chronic stress wearing out your adrenal glands. That's why you have low cortisol. And so we're going to, put you on some stuff, some supplements, some adrenal glandulars, some herbs to try and boost your cortisol levels. And that's their whole paradigm. That's their whole approach. But what they don't realize is, if there is an issue with, let's say there actually is an issue with adrenal dysfunction, that's probably just one sliver of the overall pie of 30 types of detectable dysfunction that you could see across all the systems of the body.
There's an old saying I like, is if you see the world as a hammer, then everything looks like a nail, right?
Yeah.
And, you made a really good point in there, where if someone has a biased perspective of how the body works, or what the most important cog in the wheel or node in the network is, they're always going to go to that. And you know what? Sometimes they may get great success, and that's amazing. Sometimes they may get mixed success. Sometimes it'll go the opposite way. You really never know. And I'm sure Dr. Ted on his episodes mentioned health optimization and what it is we do. The perspective I have of all this stuff is, treating disease as a focus is very challenging, because disease is so complex. We can talk about NF-kappa B and NRF2 because it's great to know the mechanisms. It's good to know and have an understanding what the body is able to do and what it's trying to do. But we are not yet at the level where we can measure all that stuff reliably across all populations. Yeah. So the question becomes, well, what is it you do when you have this kind of thing going on? And what we can measure is, we can measure some evidence of what's going on in the gut. We can measure some evidence of what's going on in the blood. We can even do the same thing for urine. And we can look at key metabolites or key aspects of evidence of where the imbalances in the system might be. Because, disease is nothing more than the ceremonial naming of a collective of symptoms as a medical profession or as an entity sees them. And I think it's great that we have that ability, because if it's a disease that's manageable via, diagnosis and treatment, I'm all for that. I'm not someone who's against Western medicine as an alternative or a holistic practitioner, because I see the benefit in it. My mentor is a doctor and was an illness medicine doctor. But to the point that you made, these things that people experience are not in the area of necessarily easily detectable. There's not a procedure for them. There's not necessarily a protocol. So you have to look at all the inputs and all the areas that we're able to affect as a practitioner or even as an individual, and try to find a way to regulate or harmonize them. If you imagine your body as a symphony, you want every instrument in the symphony to be able to play in proper timing, in the proper key, the proper, the proper frequency and the proper modality. I'm not a musician, obviously, so my analogy didn't work out so well there. But the idea is, we are the sum of our inputs. So when it comes to everything affecting everything, absolutely. And you're right in saying that what affects the gut will affect your body, because the gut is really the last layer of defense of the outside of our body. It is still not the inside, even though it's in our torso. It's the last thing that separates what gets into general circulation. Mm-hmm. So if you keep that
just explain that a little deeper, because I think probably a portion of people won't get the idea that our gut is outside of our body.
Yeah, so the gut is the last barrier. Our skin is a big barrier that protects everything that's inside it. It's a physical structure that stops things from getting in. We can get things out via our pores, which is typically sweat. If we cut ourselves, we can breach that barrier, right, into the bloodstream. The gut is still technically the outside of our body, because it is a physical barrier and a structure preventing and deciding what goes in the bloodstream and what doesn't go in the bloodstream. And what doesn't go in the bloodstream comes out as waste material. We have a bowel movement. So if we breach that barrier, then things that are not meant to be in the body, in the cells, in the bloodstream, can get in. Mm-hmm. And it's nothing more than the body responding to that as a way of trying to find a way back to center. It's just protecting itself. Mm-hmm. So if we can take care of the gut, like you said, then everything in the body gets better. In my years of clinical experience, I found that if you improve energy production, if you improve or enhance gut health, and you regulate inflammation, everything seems to get better to a point. Mm-hmm. In some cases, it totally resolves whatever someone's dealing with. In other cases, they find a way to return to normal life so they can actually address, maybe via a specialist or a modality that is targeted on what it is they're working on, they find resolution finally, but the supporting cast always needs to be considered.
Yeah, absolutely. And, one more thing I want to say on this, just to emphasize this, is if you do any sort of test, whether it's a cortisol test or whether it's a microbiome test of some kind, or a gut barrier test or something like that, or even a test for mitochondrial dysfunction, or just a standard blood test where they're detecting, let's say elevated CRP and systemic levels of inflammation. If you're picking up on one kind of dysfunction in almost any of those tests, it's probably a safe bet that there's a dozen or more other types of dysfunction that are present in other systems of the body. So speaking specifically about the gut, if you're doing a test and that test finds some significant dysbiosis or gut permeability, it's a safe bet that your problem isn't just gut permeability and dysbiosis. And that's not the only thing that you should be working on, because if that problem has been going on, especially, hopefully people understand this now based on what we've discussed so far, you probably also have done some damage to your brain, your blood-brain barrier. You've done damage to your mitochondria. You've dysregulated the epigenetic regulation of the inflammation and immune activation in your body, and a variety of other negative effects. So it's not like, hey, I just need to pop this pill that helps my gut. It's, you need to completely overhaul your nutrition and your lifestyle as much as possible to heal all of the systems of your body. That's what's actually going to get the best results.
That's a great point, because it brings up something that recently came into, my own world with a client where, she came to me because her perceived issue was that she wasn't losing body fat. And that's a lot of people, oh, I've exercised. They say this, I eat right and exercise and nothing happens, which, just because you move and just because you eat, it doesn't mean it's what you need to be doing. But we looked at all these things going on with her. So we saw that there were some imbalances in her urine. We saw there were some imbalances from the results of a stool test, and there were some deficiencies from the results of what her blood panel said. So what did I do? I didn't focus on one thing. I moved as many things in the network that my clinical abilities gave me the ability to decide. And in 2.5 weeks, she's down 10 pounds, but I didn't tell her about anything to do with calories. I just removed some foods that I suspected, and then confirmed were problematic. So you remove that, you can lower the inflammatory response. We regulated some aspects of blood sugar control, because if someone's inflamed, hypoglycemia and cortisol can become a problem. And to make energy in the mitochondria, you need what are called cofactors, vitamins, minerals. So if those aren't there, providing we can pull them through the gut, I needed to supply them not only via diet, from supplementation. And fortunately for her, she's young, so it was like an instantaneous response. But it's happened with many people where, I work on things that they don't think about, but they come to me for something that they want. I want to lose fat. I want to do this. I want to do that. So great. Let's make you feel better. Let's increase your energy levels. Let's calm down your aches and pains and inflammation. But we don't work on those things. We work on the gut. We work on managing dysbiosis. We work on reducing the overgrowth of candida and yeast. We work on calming down the gut immune system, because you can see evidence of that being heightened. So for everyone out there listening to this, Ari, what you do that's really amazing is you provide all this content for people to become informed about what they need to know more about. And then from there, it's figuring out, well, what action items do I do, knowing that I only have so many tools in my toolbox within my scope of practice as an individual, or, rather than go to the cortisol doctor or go to this person, how can I find the best person or people who can include all these variables so that my path back to health can be one that's not, I'm going to do this, I'm going to try this. It's let's support the whole thing. Because like you said, everything affects everything. Nothing is separate in the body.
Yeah, well said. I want to get back to the gut microbiome link. Is there one or two more layers to this story that are worth talking about? One that I can think of offhand is phytochemicals. So what the microbiome is doing to some of these phytochemicals in the foods we're eating, how they're metabolizing them in certain ways, and how that affects the mitochondria. So one thing we talked about, for example, last time you were in town, was pomegranates or chestnuts are rich in this compound called ellagic acid.
Yes.
And how that's, yeah. Do you want to go into this a little bit? Because there's a lot of knowledge around this, but there's also, I think, it's still, the science is very much in its infancy as far as our understanding of what species of bacteria metabolize what specific phytochemicals into what compounds, and then what those things are then doing in our bodies.
Yeah, so I sometimes ask if I'm a glutton for punishment, because I've chosen to focus and specializing in the area that changes so rapidly that I never get a chance to take a breath. If I'm not reading something, then I might fall behind. So to give someone a good description of what matters about that is the different color pigments and phytonutrients in foods are there to serve a purpose. They can act like antioxidants in and of themselves, which means that if there's an overproduction of free radicals, they might be able to blunt that. But they're also acted upon by specific species of bacteria, and these compounds can regulate or influence epigenetic expression. So there are, proanthocyanidins, which are the blue purples and blueberries. I believe it's cholerogenic acid, the compound you find in coffee. So there are certain things that are acted upon, and that can actually go one of two ways. From a diagnostic perspective, if you see elevated levels of certain things like benzoic acid, for example, in the urine, it shows you that you may have an overgrowth of bacteria, or you eat too much of a certain compound. But the vast majority of the science that I have read, you could probably add to this, is that these phytonutrient color pigments are typically great ways that the gut can further influence the overall status of health of the host by upregulating epigenetic transcription factors to prolong life, to reduce the occurrence of cancers, various other things that basically can help the body create a more symbiotic relationship, or a harmonious relationship between the food you eat, the bacteria that process everything we eat. We have to remember that nothing goes through our system without being acted upon by the bacteria. So if you're eating and you want to be able to enhance this process that you bring up, the easiest way to do that is every time you go to the grocery store, pick a different vegetable, focus on a different color, rotate different kinds of fruits, because we don't know what the best combination of fruits and vegetables are. We don't know what our innate microbiome profile is. So right now, the best we can do from a practical perspective is include as many different things as possible. Providing you feel a positive response, you're likely supplying additional cofactors for the enhancement of our health via dietary intervention.
Hmm. Yeah, absolutely. I will add just a couple of things to this, which is, and like I said, the science is still just it really in its infancy on this topic. I think we don't know so much. We know we can measure a lot. There's a lot of research that has measured like intake of certain phytochemical compounds or foods rich in certain phytochemicals and end effects. We can measure, for example, how it affects outcomes in a particular disease or levels of inflammation or mitochondrial function or something like that, or markers of mitochondrial biogenesis. But what's not that well known is this intermediate step of what the bacteria in the gut are doing to these phytochemicals in many cases. And then because what's happening is they're literally, in many cases, taking the original phytochemical in that food, essentially digesting it, metabolizing it into some other chemical. And then that's the new chemical that gets into your body that actually exerts the biological effects on your cells. So one example of this that we talked about last time you were in town was pomegranates and chestnuts and a few other foods are rich in a compound called ellagic acid, which is metabolized by the gut microbiome into a compound called urolithin A, which is one of the most powerful promoters of mitophagy, which is essentially autophagy specific to mitochondria. It's sort of repair and recycling of damaged parts of the mitochondria, which is really, really important for anti-aging and for maintaining healthy mitochondria. What's interesting here that I want to point out to people is there's actually in this specific case, there's some research that has tried to figure out what specific species of bacteria are doing this metabolization of ellagic acid to urolithin A. And there were a few studies that haven't found it. And then the last one I read maybe a year ago was a really recent study. They believed that they did find the specific species. And it was actually this, I'd never even heard of this species of bacteria. It was this really obscure one that's not talked about. It's not any of the bifidobacterias or lactobacillus or any of these. Really kind of a rare one. And so if you think about that, that's a really interesting thing in and of itself, right? Because what they're finding is that this powerful promoter of this key process in our body, mitophagy, from ellagic acid, from the foods we're eating, is being done by this one specific species of bacteria that's actually quite rare and not common. It's not in any of the probiotics that anyone's taking. And for people with dysbiotic guts, may not even be present in their gut microbiome at all. So what you might extrapolate from that, at least what I do, is I think, well, how many other examples is that the case for? So in a case where somebody...
In a different direction, they were doing a clinical trial of a pharmaceutical for its efficacy. I'm forgetting what the specific thing was. I think it might have been something to do with the immune system or the brain. And they found that in people with a specific strain of bacteria, that bacteria inactivated the active component in the pharmaceutical and resulted in no effect. So people became non-responders only because of the specific makeup of the gut microbiota.
Oh, wow. That's crazy.
You look at it in both directions, right?
Yeah.
For the pursuit of health, you need this compound for maybe regulating a specific activity. You need this bacteria. And that's something that no one controls for yet in clinical trials.
Right.
I mean, I have a hunch, a hypothesis that the next massive wave of medicine is going to be, microbial medicine, right? Mm-hmm. Microbiology and the understanding of how the interaction between substance A, substance B, and substance C is influenced by specific bacteria and species. But then we have to figure out a layer deeper, well, what's inside of someone? And, what over the course of their life modulates the changes in that. So that's why this area of research is so promising, yet there's so much to comb through because we know far less than I shouldn't say than we think we do. In terms of figuring it all out, if that's even a thing, we are at the infancy.
Yeah.
But we know that, we can derive patterns and trends from things we can test and measure. And then we can look at evidence from what healthy people do or healthy populations around the world versus, what the evidence of someone like, for example, a stroke victim. before the stroke, their bacterial profile might not be that different, but for 2 to 4 weeks after a stroke, their gut bacteria is in a constant state of flux. We're looking at a stroke. That's, something to do only with the brain, but we see a change in the gut based upon the effects of a stroke.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. I want to mention, I think I agree with you that this is going to be a huge trend in medicine in the coming decades. I want to mention just a couple of thoughts on that. So one is this whole concept of the phytochemicals. I think that there are probably dozens of other examples of the one that I just mentioned. So if somebody has a dysbiotic gut, that they might not have the bacterial species in the right amounts or the presence of them at all to be able to metabolize dozens of different phytochemicals that are associated with all kinds of health benefits, whether it's curcumin or EGCG from tea or many, many others. They might not be metabolizing lots and lots of different beneficial phytochemicals into the proper nutrient that's actually getting into our bloodstream where it's going to exert those beneficial effects. So in other words, it's possible that those phytochemicals may only have the proper benefits in somebody who has a fairly healthy or very healthy gut microbiome.
I agree with you as well.
Yeah. One more prediction on this trend of microbiome medicine. There's so much research now showing that all these different factors, lifestyle factors, can impact on our gut microbiome. So, for example, sun exposure. I saw a study recently showing that light exposure can impact on our gut microbiome. That there's research that exercise can. There's obviously research showing that the diet has a huge impact on it. So, sleep deprivation or circadian rhythm disruption can also disturb the microbiome. I think that when all is said and done, after we dig into this in excruciating detail and find all this map of, the thousands of bacterial species and what chemicals they metabolize and what functions they do and how it impacts this and how the whole network exists with all the different systems of the body, I think ultimately what we will then arrive at is either a very complicated system of hundreds of different supplements that you can potentially take, or the possibility that living a healthful lifestyle in touch with nature, getting sunlight, moving your body, being exposed to the elements, to hormesis, eating a very diverse diet of whole unprocessed foods is probably still going to be superior to this vast array of thousands of different gut boosting supplements and drugs that they're going to develop.
I'm with you there in hoping that it goes that direction.
Yeah.
Because, exercise and nutrition, or exercise and supplementation in the health field are still perceived by the vast majority of people to be the two most important drivers of fixing everything. And I mean, there are aspects to both of them that can be negative without necessarily being mindful of that. The whole ability to regulate circadian rhythm, to get outside at the appropriate times, to not look at artificial light at the appropriate times, to have a regular bedtime routine, to even just spend time in nature to activate your parasympathetic nervous system, to doing things like meditation and humming. It all affects the gut, which will affect the periphery.
Mm-hmm.
Exercise in a beneficial way, yes, can stimulate changes in gut bacteria that can stimulate peripheral mitochondrial biogenesis. But when you exercise, you drive blood away from the gut. So you can induce leaky gut via over-exercising with things like chronic CrossFit or marathon trainings or various things that people think, well, I'm moving, it's good for me because it's exercise, therefore it's healthy. I do feel that because we don't know what a perfect gut looks like, it might be like asking the question, well, what's the perfect fingerprint? What's the perfect hair color or eye color? And it's like, I don't know that such a thing exists, because why would 8 billion people on this planet all contain a different microbiome if there's one ideal we want to move towards? Rather, it might be what signals are most appropriate or most important for your specific gut microbiota as it relates to your specific physiology, your specific genetic expression. But, if you look at success leaving clues, humans got pretty good at being in touch with their environment. And then now, because we live lives closer to that of zoo animals sometimes, it's like a frequency or a disharmony resonance of what we should be experiencing versus what we do experience on a regular basis. And we're the sum of our signals. So everything you've done up until now has led to this moment in your life, which sounds overly profound. But if you examine that statement in the context of your health, well, if it's taken you 50 years to develop an autoimmune disease or chronic fatigue and blah, 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 well, you need to figure out which signals you need to reverse engineer based upon everything we've spoken about today. And that's your starting point. And then it's the consistency of execution there to the best of your ability with the current depth of knowledge that we have.
Yeah. Well said. Very well said.
Thank you, sir.
Awesome. Roland, well, thank you so much for coming on the show. I've really, really enjoyed this conversation. It was a blast, and it's always a blast hanging out with you, my friend. As a final word, I would love for you to just talk a bit about the work you do with health optimization practice and what it's all about. And also, if people want to work with you, how can they do that?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for the opportunity. You mentioned at the beginning of the episode, Dr. Ted Atricoso, the founder of Health Optimization, is my mentor. I've been bouncing around the world, jet lagging my microbiota and mitochondria for the last 2 years, just learning from him because the opportunity was presented. Now we're at the point where it's a global movement. So it is, essentially, it's very easy to figure out. It's nothing more than the world's first health-only focused practice paradigm. So we don't treat disease. We do a lot of what we discussed today. We detect and correct the biochemical imbalances going on that we can measure in the body. The key there is the measurement of them all. We don't make a decision without testing it first. So this way it's as objective and qualitative as it can be rather than subjective and quantitative. And we specialize in nothing other than the health of the basic fundamental cell. So yes, we take care of the nucleus, the mitochondria, the endoplasmic reticulum, so that all they can do is do what they're known to do or do what they want to do. And that's regulate the health and longevity of the cell. So what we do basically is we test a client based upon their individual biochemical results of the blood, the urine, the stool results of their metabolomics tests. And then from there, we do an analysis and we present the client the practice platform that they need in order to restore their health to the optimal level that we can take it. So if someone is interested in doing any work with myself or anyone involved, they can go to healthoptimizationmedicine.org to get a better background or an understanding. We've launched a clinical framework as an education modality that we are in the process of expanding right now. And if someone wants to get in contact with me, they can always send me an email at rolandpankowicz@gmail.com. Or I'm sure, Ari, if they message you and they want to get in contact with me, I'm sure you wouldn't have a problem facilitating that.
Of course, yeah, we'll forward it to you. And the email, let's just spell your last name. So the first name is Roland, which is
Roland, and then it's PANKEWICH@gmail.com. And that's just my personal one because it allows me to do telemedicine practice with Google Docs. This way the client doesn't have to be physically with me.
I was just going to ask. So you practice up in Toronto?
Yes, but I have clients all over the U.S. and in Asia. So
yeah.
For me, the best way to do that is I can get things sent to them. They can commission their own lab tests, and then the results get sent to me, and then I can do everything correspondence online. So this way they don't have to physically be present in Canada because we're still coming out of winter. And if you're in Southern California, stay where you are. Trust me.
Awesome, my friend. Well, it was so good to have you on. For everybody listening, I highly recommend working with Roland. He's a very close personal friend of mine. I've known him for, how long have I known you now? Two years now?
Yeah.
And I trust him. I would send my family to him. So he has that level of my trust and respect for the work he does. So if you guys are looking for a good clinician to work with, highly recommend reaching out to him. Roland, thank you again so much. Such a pleasure. And
thank you very much.
I know we talked briefly about having you on for a part 2 where we do an even deeper, geekier dive into some of the mechanisms here. And I would love to have you on again and maybe a 3rd and 4th time to talk about some other topics as well. So
welcome, my friend.
Such a pleasure, my friend. And look forward to talking to you again very soon.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for listening today. And we'll talk to you soon, Ari. Bye.
Awesome. Hey there, this is Ari again. One more quick thing before you go. Just make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Energy Blueprint, and also make sure to subscribe to this podcast on your favorite podcast platform, whether that's iTunes or Stitcher or anything else. I hope you guys enjoyed this interview, and I will see you again next week.